Part 1. The Calm Before the Storm. When I met my wife, Sarah, I was a single dad. My son, James, was just 8 years old at the time, quiet, sweet, and the absolute light of my life. Raising him alone after his mom passed wasn't easy, but we were a team. I'll never forget how we'd spend our weekends, just the two of us building Lego cities on the living room floor, going for hikes where he'd pick me flowers, even if they were weeds, and ending every night with me reading him the same book he loved. Where the Wild Things Are, for what felt like the 1000th time. He was my whole world. When Sarah entered the picture, I genuinely thought we'd hit the jackpot. She was beautiful, kind, and seemed to click with James immediately. She had a daughter, Emma, who was just a year older than James, spirited and outgoing in the way James was quiet and introspective. From the start, I hoped our blended family would create something even greater. 2 single parents finding love, 2 kids building a sibling bond that would last a lifetime. Those first couple of years felt like the dream was coming true. Sarah would compliment James for how polite and well-behaved he was. Emma wasn't exactly best friends with him, but they managed to coexist in their own ways. Sure, there were little bumps in the road. Emma sometimes teased James for being too quiet or boring, but hey, they were kids. Sarah would usually shrug and say, "That's just how siblings act." I chalked it up to growing pains, thinking they'd find common ground in time. We got married a year into dating, and that's when Sarah and Emma moved into our home. I remember being so damn excited. I thought to myself, James will finally have a sister, and I'll have the chance to give him the family he deserves. I worked overtime to make sure everyone felt comfortable. I gave Emma the spare room and let her pick out new paint colors and decorations. James even gave up his gaming corner in the living room so Emma could have a space for her art stuff. At first, it felt like we were doing something special. I watched Sarah help James with his homework, and Emma would occasionally play video games with him, even if she complained that his aim sucked. We went on family outings to the park, to the movies, and for a while, I was convinced we were happy. Sure, there were small cracks here and there, but nothing I thought couldn't be patched. Looking back now, I wonder how I didn't see it sooner. Those cracks? They weren't cracks at all. They were fault lines. And when they finally broke, the whole foundation came crashing down. Part 2. The little things start to add up. At first, I brushed it off. Blending 2 families isn't easy, right? I figured Sarah and Emma were still adjusting to life with James and me, and that any bumps in the road were just normal growing pains. But little things started to stand out, things I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. It began with the subtle stuff. Emma always got the best of everything. When we'd all get into the car, Emma would rush to claim the front seat, and Sarah would just laugh it off, saying, "Let her, James doesn't mind." Then there were the constant shopping trips. Sarah would take Emma out for new clothes, fancy shoes, and the latest makeup. When I suggested she take James along to pick out something he liked, she'd wave it off. "Boys don't care about clothes. James is fine." James, being James, never said a word. He just quietly accepted it. What really started to gnaw at me were Sarah's little digs. She loved Emma, dotingly, obviously, but when it came to James, her tone was different. "Emma's so hard-working, she's a straight-A student. I just wish James would push himself a bit more." Or, "Emma is so outgoing, she's really a leader. I guess boys like James are just more closed off." I'd defend him every time, saying, "James is plenty hardworking. He's just different from Emma. That doesn't mean he's not trying." But Sarah would smile that tight little smile and change the subject. I told myself I was being oversensitive, but those moments added up, bit by bit, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. One night at dinner, it hit me harder than ever. Sarah had made Emma's favorite meal, something fancy with shrimp and a sauce I can't pronounce, and James had quietly picked at his plate. When I asked him what was wrong, he said, "It's okay, I'm not that hungry." After dinner, I found him sitting on the porch alone, sketchbook forgotten on his lap. I sat down beside him, trying to lighten the mood. "Hey, what's up, bud? You barely touched your food." James shrugged without looking up. "Emma said shrimp's too fancy for me. She said I probably wouldn't like it anyway." I felt my chest tighten. "She said that?" James nodded, still not meeting my eyes. "It's fine. She's probably right." I was furious, at Emma, sure, but mostly at Sarah. What was she teaching her daughter? And how could she sit there, meal after meal, letting James feel so unwanted in his own home? I pulled James into a hug and told him, "You don't need to listen to any of that. You deserve as much as anyone else, okay? You're incredible, James." He nodded and muttered, "Okay, Dad," but I could hear the doubt in his voice. That night, I lay in bed while Sarah scrolled on her phone beside me, completely oblivious to the hurt she'd caused. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, not yet. I still wanted to believe this was all just a misunderstanding. I kept telling myself, families take time to blend. It's not favoritism. It's not that bad. But deep down I knew. James was fading into the background in his own home. And if I didn't do something about it, no one would. Part 3. The Christmas that broke me. Christmas used to be my favorite time of year. It was ours, James and me. After his mom passed, I worked hard to keep the magic alive for him. We'd bake cookies that turned out like bricks, watch movies in pajamas, and I'd always find gifts that meant something to him. Little things like a new set of colored pencils or a book he'd been excited about. Christmas wasn't about the money. It was about showing James he was loved. This year, Sarah wanted to take over. "Let me plan everything," she said with a smile. "I want it to be special." I agreed, trusting her. I figured she'd make Christmas feel magical for everyone, but as the day got closer, I started noticing the imbalance. Sarah and Emma spent weeks shopping, bags of gifts piling up in Emma's room. I'd catch glimpses of designer boxes, shiny ribbons, and high-end electronics. Meanwhile, any time I asked about James, Sarah brushed me off. "I got him a couple of things. Don't worry about it. Boys are harder to shop for anyway." I should have said something then. I should have pushed back. But I didn't. Christmas morning came, and I walked into the living room to see Emma surrounded by a mountain of gifts. Sarah was already taking pictures as Emma unwrapped designer shoes, art supplies, a new phone, and concert tickets she'd been begging for. James sat quietly on the other side of the room, his little pile of gifts in front of him. I watched him open the first one, socks. "Thanks," he said softly, holding them up for Sarah to see. She didn't even look at him. Her focus was still on Emma squealing over her concert tickets. The next gift was a cheap action figure from a show James hadn't watched in years. He tried to smile, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He glanced over at me, like he didn't want me to see how hurt he was. "Is that everything?" Sarah asked Emma cheerfully. "Yeah." Emma beamed, grinning like she'd won the lottery. "This is the best Christmas ever." I couldn't take it. I turned to Sarah. "Is that everything?" I asked, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" I gestured to James, who was staring down at the socks in his lap. "You spent weeks buying Emma gifts." "Weeks. And this is all James gets? Socks and a plastic toy?" Sarah's expression turned defensive. "Boys don't care about gifts the way girls do. He doesn't mind." James looked up and forced a smile. "It's fine, Dad. I didn't really need anything." That broke me. I turned to Emma, who rolled her eyes and muttered, "It's not our fault he's boring." "Emma," I said sharply, "go to your room." Her face went pale. "What? I didn't do anything." "Go to your room. Now." Sarah stood up, her voice rising. "What the hell, my name? You're ruining Christmas." "No," I snapped. "You already did that." I turned to Sarah, my voice shaking with anger. "Do you even hear yourself? Do you see how you've treated him? You've spent all morning spoiling Emma while my son, sits here like he's invisible. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't let her. This isn't okay. I won't let James feel like he doesn't matter, not in his own home. Not ever. I walked over to James, put a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Come on, bud. Let's go." We left the house that morning. I didn't even care where we were going, I just knew I had to get him out of there. I took him to his favorite diner, where we sat in a booth by the window. He ordered pancakes and hot chocolate, stirring it quietly as he stared out at the snow. I tried to lighten the mood. "Best pancakes in town, right?" James smiled faintly. "Yeah, they're good." We sat there for a while, mostly in silence. Then, out of nowhere, he looked up and said softly, "It's okay, Dad. I know you tried." That broke me all over again. I smiled at him, trying to hold it together, and said, "You deserve better, James. I promise you, I'll make this right." And in that moment I knew this couldn't go on. Sarah's favoritism, Emma's attitude, the way my son was treated like an afterthought. It wasn't going to happen anymore. I'd fight for James with everything I had. He deserved better. Part 4, the final straw. After Christmas, things didn't get better. If anything, they got worse. Sarah grew colder toward me, as if I was the problem for calling her out. Emma barely acknowledged James, except for the occasional jab or eye roll when he was in the room. I did my best to keep things together, but it felt like there were two families living under one roof, Sarah and Emma on one side, and James and me on the other. I kept telling myself it was temporary. That Sarah would see how unfair she was being. That Emma would outgrow her attitude. I wanted to believe this was all fixable because I didn't want to admit that I'd failed, that I'd married someone who couldn't love my son the way he deserved. Then came the Saturday. I'd been working overtime for weeks to pay off the Christmas credit card bills, most of which were from Emma's gifts. I was exhausted when I got home that afternoon, but I was looking forward to spending the weekend with James. He'd been talking about a new movie coming out, and I promised we'd go see it together. As I walked into the house, I heard Sarah and Emma talking in the kitchen. They had no idea I was there. "Why does James have to come on vacation with us?" Emma whined. Sarah sighed, like she was exhausted from even hearing the question. "He doesn't have to, sweetheart. I'll talk to your stepdad. He'll understand." "But I don't want him there," Emma insisted. "It's supposed to be a fun trip for us. He's so boring, and he ruins everything." My blood froze. Sarah's voice dropped, as if she were sharing a secret. "I know, honey. Don't worry. I'll figure it out. Your stepdad just has a soft spot for him. But he'll see reason. James can stay with his grandparents. This trip should be about you and me." I stood there in the hallway, heart pounding. Did I just hear that right? My wife, someone who vowed to love both me and my son, was actively planning to exclude James from a family trip. She wanted to leave him behind like he didn't matter, like he wasn't part of the family at all. And the worst part? Emma was laughing about it. I couldn't hold back. I stepped into the kitchen, startling them both. Sarah froze, her face turning pale when she saw me. "What was that about James staying with my parents?" I asked, my voice low but steady. Sarah recovered quickly, plastering on a fake smile. "Oh, honey, we were just talking. Emma thinks it might be nice to have a little mother-daughter time on the trip. That's all." "That's all?" I repeated. "So you're telling me you're planning a family trip where James isn't invited?" "It's not like that," Sarah said quickly, her tone shifting to defensive. "I just thought it would be easier for everyone. James will have more fun at your parents' house anyway. You know how he is, he doesn't like big trips." I could feel my anger building. "How he is? Sarah, he's a kid. He deserves to go on this trip just as much as Emma does. You don't get to decide he's not welcome. Don't twist this," Sarah snapped, her voice rising. "You always act like I don't care about James, but I do. I'm just trying to make everyone happy. Emma needs this trip. She's been so stressed with school lately, she deserves to have a good time without. Without what? I interrupted. Without James? Without my son being there to ruin it for her? Emma chimed in then, arms crossed. He does ruin things. He never wants to do anything fun, and he's so quiet all the time. Why can't it just be us for once? I turned to Emma, trying to keep my voice calm even though my hands were shaking. Emma, James is part of this family, whether you like it or not. You don't get to decide who's included. Emma scoffed and looked to Sarah for backup. And then Sarah did the one thing I'll never forgive, she took Emma's side. Why are you making such a big deal about this? Sarah snapped. You're overreacting. It's one trip. One trip? I repeated, barely able to keep my voice steady. Sarah, this isn't just about the trip. It's about the way you've treated my son since the day you moved in. You've spent years putting Emma first, and pushing James aside like he doesn't matter. And now you're literally planning a vacation without him? How do you think that makes him feel? How do you think I feel, hearing you talk about my son like he's a burden? Sarah opened her mouth to argue again, but I cut her off. I'm done, Sarah. I've let this go on for too long. If you can't love James like family, if you can't even treat him with basic respect, then you and Emma don't belong here. Sarah's face twisted with anger. You're kicking us out over this? You're being ridiculous. No, I said firmly. I'm being a father. And I won't let anyone make my son feel unwanted in his own home. Sarah and Emma left that night. Sarah screamed, cried, and accused me of choosing James over my marriage. And you know what? She was right. I did choose James. Because he's my son, and he deserves to feel loved, wanted, and safe. That night, as the house fell quiet, I sat next to James on the couch. He leaned his head against my shoulder, and after a long silence, he whispered, "Thanks, Dad." And at that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice. Part 5, The Showdown. The day after I overheard Sarah and Emma planning to exclude James from our vacation, I decided enough was enough. At dinner, I laid it all on the table. We need to talk, I said, looking directly at Sarah. Her expression turned defensive immediately. About what? About the way you treat James. About what I heard yesterday, how you're planning a trip without him. Sarah scoffed, brushing it off. It's not a big deal. Emma and I just wanted some time together. James wouldn't care. I looked at James, sitting quietly, avoiding eye contact. Do you want to go on the trip, buddy? James nodded hesitantly. Yeah, I thought it was for all of us. Sarah sighed. You're blowing this out of proportion. Emma just... No, I cut her off. This isn't just about the trip. It's about how you've been treating him. The favoritism, the exclusion. You've spent years pushing James aside, and I've let it go because I wanted this family to work. But I won't let my son feel unwanted in his own home. Emma rolled her eyes. He ruins everything. Enough. I snapped. James deserves better than this. Sarah stood, angry. You're choosing him over us? I am choosing him, I said firmly. He's my son. If you can't treat him like family, then you don't belong here. That night, Sarah and Emma packed their bags. Sarah called me ridiculous, and swore I'd regret it. But as James leaned his head on my shoulder later and whispered, "Thanks, Dad," I knew I'd made the right choice. Part 6, My Son Deserves Better. The night Sarah and Emma left, the house was quiet, peaceful, almost. James sat beside me on the couch, knees pulled to his chest. After a while, he asked softly, "Are they coming back?" "No," I said gently. "They're not." He nodded, staring down at his lap, before whispering, "Good. I didn't like how they made me feel." That broke me. I pulled him into a hug. "This is your home, James. I'm sorry I let it get this far, but I promise, no one will ever make you feel that way again." In the weeks that followed, it was just the two of us again. We painted his room his favorite shade of blue, hung up his artwork, and spent our weekends together like we used to. Slowly, I saw him come back to life, laughing, sketching, talking about his dreams again. One afternoon, after a movie and burgers, James turned to me and said, "Thanks, Dad. For everything." I smiled and replied, "Always, buddy. Always." Looking back, I have no regrets. Choosing my son over a toxic marriage wasn't a hard decision. He deserves better, and I'll spend every day making sure he knows it.